Good evening. Tonight, we're going to drift slowly through a quiet corner of history. Not a battle, not a plague, not a coronation. Tonight, we're going to talk about something much smaller, much slower, and much more human. We are going to talk about dating, courtship, love, and the lack of it, marriage, and the strange rules that surrounded it. We are going to talk about how ordinary people in medieval Europe, roughly between the years 1000 and 1400, went about finding a partner, falling in love, or simply agreeing to share a life with someone else. There is no need to remember any of this. There is no test in the morning. You can simply let the words pass over you the way water passes over stones in a slow river. If your eyes grow heavy, that is exactly what is supposed to happen. Let them close. I will keep talking. Let us begin at the beginning with a simple question. Did medieval people fall in love the way we do today? The word romance did exist in the Middle Ages, but it did not mean what it means now. A romance was simply a long story, usually written in verse, about knights, quests, and distant kingdoms. It had very little to do with two people choosing each other because their hearts felt something warm and fluttering. For most of the medieval period, marriage was not considered a private matter between two individuals. It was considered a public transaction between two families. Land was involved, livestock was involved, political alliances were involved. A wedding could settle a border dispute between two small estates just as easily as it could join two people who happened to like each other. This does not mean love was absent. It means love was not expected to arrive first. In many cases, families hoped that affection would grow slowly after the wedding, once two people had lived side by side for months or years. Affection was treated less like a spark and more like a plant, something you tended patiently after the seeds had already been planted by someone else. Historians who study medieval letters and court records have found plenty of evidence that people did fall deeply in love. Poems were written, longing was expressed, grief over lost partners filled pages of private writing. But the falling in love in most households tended to happen after the arrangement was made, not before. This idea can feel strange to modern ears. We are used to love coming first and commitment coming second. In medieval life, for the majority of the population, the order was often reversed. Let your mind rest on that idea for a moment. There is no need to judge it. It was simply a different order of things, shaped by a world where survival, land, and family alliances mattered more urgently than personal preference. We will come back to romantic love a little later, particularly the version practiced among nobles, which had its own peculiar rules. But first, let us talk about how ordinary villagers, the farmers, the millers, the weavers, actually found partners at all. In small medieval villages, most people did not travel far from where they were born. A person's entire world might consist of one village, the fields around it, the nearest market town, and perhaps a neighbouring parish where cousins lived. This meant the pool of potential partners was small. Everyone more or less knew everyone else. Because of this, courtship in rural areas often happened slowly, in plain sight, over years. Children who grew up together as playmates might, by their late teens, begin to be considered as potential spouses by their parents. There was no dramatic moment of meeting a stranger across a crowded room. Instead, familiarity slowly turned into consideration, and consideration slowly turned into arrangement. Markets, however, did play an important role. A village market day, held weekly or monthly, brought together people from several surrounding villages. Young men and women who rarely left their own parish suddenly had a wider view of who else existed in the world. Historians believe that market days, along with church gatherings, harvest festivals and seasonal fairs, were among the few occasions where young, unmarried people from different villages could actually meet, speak, and be noticed by one another. Church, in particular, was central to this. Sunday Mass was not only a religious obligation, it was also, whether anyone admitted it aloud or not, one of the few weekly social events where the entire community gathered in one place. Young people stood in view of each other. Parents took note of who looked at whom. A glance held a little too long across the nave of a church could become the subject of village gossip within days. Village life had very little privacy. This meant courtship, when it did happen naturally between two young people, was rarely a secret for long. Neighbours noticed. Gossip travelled quickly through shared wells, shared ovens and shared fields. In many ways, an entire village participated in the courtship of its young people, whether the couple wanted that involvement or not. Once a family decided that a marriage should happen, whether inspired by mutual attraction or by simple convenience, the process moved into something closer to a business negotiation. Central to this negotiation was the question of property. For peasant families, this might mean a small parcel of land, a few animals, tools, or household goods. For wealthier families, merchants, minor nobility, or landowners, the negotiations could involve significant sums of money, called a dowry, paid by the bride's family to the groom's family, or sometimes the reverse arrangement, called a bride price, paid by the groom's family to the bride's family. These negotiations were often handled not by the young couple themselves, but by parents, and sometimes by professional matchmakers or local clergy who acted as intermediaries. In wealthier households, contracts were sometimes drawn up in writing, listing exactly what property, animals, coins or goods would transfer between families upon marriage. The age at which people married varied considerably depending on class and region. Among peasants, marriage often occurred later, sometimes in the mid to late 20s, because a young couple needed to accumulate enough resources, a small cottage, some land, basic tools, before they could realistically support a household. Among nobility, marriages were often arranged much earlier, sometimes even in childhood, though the marriage would not typically be consummated until both parties were considered physically mature, often in their mid-teens at the earliest. It is worth pausing here to notice something important. The image many people carry of medieval marriage involving very young children being wed immediately is often exaggerated in popular imagination. While child betrothals for political reasons did occur among nobility, the church generally required a minimum age, and actual cohabitation was usually delayed until both parties were older. For the vast majority of ordinary people, marriage happened in early adulthood, not childhood. The medieval church held enormous influence over who could marry whom and under what conditions. Marriage was considered a sacrament, a sacred bond, and therefore fell under church law rather than purely local custom. The church required, at least in theory, that both parties consent to the marriage. This might surprise some listeners. Even in an age of arranged marriages, church doctrine insisted that a valid marriage required the free consent of both the man and the woman. In practice, this consent was often influenced heavily by family pressure, economic necessity, or simple lack of alternatives. But the principle existed, and occasionally it was actually used by young people to resist a marriage they did not want. There are historical records of individuals, particularly women, who successfully appealed to church courts to annul or prevent a marriage on the grounds that they had never truly consented. These cases were not common, but they were not unheard of either. They remind us that even within a rigid system, small spaces for individual will did exist. The church also enforced rules about who could not marry whom. Marrying a close relative was forbidden, and the definition of close relative was surprisingly broad, sometimes extending to distant cousins, or even to people connected only through godparent relationships. In small villages where everyone was related by some distant thread, this occasionally created complicated legal puzzles requiring special church permission, called a dispensation, to allow a marriage to proceed. Additionally, the church discouraged, and at times forbade, marriages during certain periods of the religious calendar, such as Lent or Advent. Weddings clustered instead around certain permitted seasons, meaning entire villages might see a flurry of marriages in early autumn after harvest, when both the church calendar allowed it and families had more food and resources to spare for a celebration. While peasants married largely for practical survival, the nobility developed a much more elaborate, almost theatrical, culture around courtship. This is where the idea of courtly love emerges, a concept that has fascinated historians for centuries. Courtly love was a set of customs, popularized in poetry and songs from the 12th century onward, particularly in the courts of southern France. It imagined an idealized, almost worshipful form of romantic devotion, often between a knight and a noblewoman who was, importantly, usually married to someone else entirely. Under the rules of courtly love, a knight might dedicate great feats of bravery, poetry, or service to a lady he admired from a respectful distance. This affection was expected to remain largely unconsummated, existing instead as a kind of elegant, drawn-out yearning. The lady, in turn, might accept small tokens, a ribbon, a glove, a handkerchief, as symbols of the devotion offered to her. It is important to understand that courtly love was, in many ways, more literary fantasy than lived reality for most nobles. It provided entertainment, songs, and stories for court life, and it offered an emotional outlet in a world where actual marriages among nobility were almost always arranged for political reasons, with little regard for personal affection. Courtly love gave nobles a socially acceptable space to imagine romantic longing, separate entirely from the practical business of an arranged marriage. Tournaments, feasts, and courtly gatherings became stages for this kind of performance. A knight might wear a lady's token into a jousting match. Poets, called troubadours, travelled between courts singing songs of longing and devotion. These songs, many of which survive today, describe emotions remarkably similar to what we would recognize as romantic love, longing, jealousy, joy, heartbreak, even though they were rarely connected to the practical marriages actually taking place around them. Alongside official church doctrine and noble courtly customs, ordinary people also turned to folk magic to influence matters of the heart. Belief in charms, potions, and small rituals meant to attract love, or occasionally to cause it to fade, was widespread throughout medieval Europe. Herbalists and wise women, often the same individuals who served as midwives or healers in a village, sometimes prepared small charms believed to increase a person's attractiveness or luck in love. Certain herbs, such as coriander seeds, mandrake root, or verbena, were associated with romantic influence in folk belief, though the Church officially condemned such practices as superstition and at times as something more dangerous, bordering on witchcraft. Some folk customs involved simple, almost playful rituals. Young unmarried women in certain regions were said to observe particular saints' days, such as St. Agnes's Eve, by performing small rituals, fasting, or reciting specific prayers in hopes of dreaming that night of their future husband. These customs blended religious devotion with folk superstition in a way the official church often tolerated quietly, even while disapproving of magic in principle. Written love charms, small pieces of parchment inscribed with symbols, prayers, or names, were sometimes carried in pockets or sewn into clothing. Archaeologists have occasionally found such items preserved in medieval sites, offering small, quiet glimpses into the private hopes of individuals whose names history otherwise forgot entirely. Chapter 7. Gifts, tokens and small gestures. Across every level of medieval society, small physical gifts played an important role in courtship. These were rarely expensive items. Among peasants, a suitor might offer a carved wooden object, a small piece of embroidered cloth, or flowers gathered from a field. Among wealthier families, gifts might include small pieces of jewellery, ribbons, or gloves. Gloves, in particular, held special symbolic weight throughout much of medieval Europe. Giving a glove to someone could represent a pledge, a promise, or a formal token of affection. In some regions, exchanging gloves during a betrothal ceremony was considered nearly as significant as exchanging rings, a custom that would later become far more standardized. Rings themselves were used as symbols of betrothal, though the elaborate diamond engagement ring familiar today did not exist yet. A ring in medieval betrothal was more often a simple band, sometimes inscribed with a short phrase or the initials of both parties, symbolizing a promise rather than serving as a display of wealth. Written love charms, small pieces of parchment inscribed with symbols, prayers, or names, were sometimes carried in pockets or sewn into clothing. Archaeologists have occasionally found such items preserved in medieval sites, offering small, quiet glimpses into the private hopes of individuals whose names history otherwise forgot entirely. Chapter 7. Gifts, tokens and small gestures. Across every level of medieval society, small physical gifts played an important role in courtship. These were rarely expensive items. Among peasants, a suitor might offer a carved wooden object, a small piece of embroidered cloth, or flowers gathered from a field. Among wealthier families, gifts might include small pieces of jewellery, ribbons, or gloves. Gloves, in particular, held special symbolic weight throughout much of medieval Europe. Giving a glove to someone could represent a pledge, a promise, or a formal token of affection. In some regions, exchanging gloves during a betrothal ceremony was considered nearly as significant as exchanging rings, a custom that would later become far more standardized. Rings themselves were used as symbols of betrothal, though the elaborate diamond engagement ring familiar today did not exist yet. A ring in medieval betrothal was more often a simple band, sometimes inscribed with a short phrase or the initials of both parties, symbolizing a promise rather than serving as a display of wealth. A medieval wedding for ordinary people was often a relatively brief and simple affair, especially compared to modern weddings. The ceremony itself frequently took place not inside the church, but just outside its main doors, in the church porch, with the priest asking each party to state their consent publicly, in front of witnesses. After this public exchange of vows at the church entrance, the couple and priest might move inside for a nuptial mass. Though for poorer households, this additional step was sometimes skipped entirely due to cost or time constraints. Celebrations following the ceremony varied enormously depending on wealth. Among peasants, a wedding feast might consist of little more than bread, ale, and whatever food the village could contribute communally, shared among neighbours in a simple, joyful gathering. Among wealthier merchants or nobility, weddings could stretch across multiple days, involving elaborate feasts, entertainment from travelling musicians, and lavish displays of food meant to demonstrate the family's status and generosity. One curious custom practiced in various forms across different regions involved the symbolic giving away of the bride, and rituals meant to formally transfer responsibility for her from her father's household to her husband's household. This reflected the underlying legal reality of medieval marriage, that a woman's economic and legal identity was, in most cases, absorbed into her husband's upon marriage. Because life expectancy was considerably shorter than today, and childbirth carried significant risk, widowhood was extremely common in medieval society, affecting people at what we would now consider a young age. Widows occupied an unusual and, in some ways, uniquely independent position within medieval law. Unlike unmarried daughters, who remained under their father's legal authority, or wives whose legal identity merged with their husband's, a widow often gained control over her own property, at least a portion of it guaranteed to her under a legal arrangement called dower rights. This meant that widows, particularly wealthier widows, were sometimes considered quite desirable partners for remarriage, not despite their previous marriage, but partly because of the property and independence it had granted them. Remarriage among widows and widowers was extremely common, and it was not unusual for a person to marry 2, 3, or even 4 times across their lifetime as successive spouses passed away. Widowers with young children often remarried quickly out of practical necessity, needing someone to help manage a household and care for children. Widows with sufficient property, on the other hand, sometimes had the rare luxury, for a medieval woman, of choosing whether to remarry at all or to remain independently in control of their own affairs. It is worth remembering that medieval Europe was not one single unified culture. Customs varied enormously between regions, and across the several centuries we grouped together under the term medieval. In parts of Scandinavia, for example, courtship customs allowed somewhat more freedom for young women to express preference in choosing a partner, compared to some southern European regions, where family control over marriage arrangements tended to be stricter. In parts of the Italian city-states, particularly among wealthy merchant families, marriage negotiations became increasingly focused on dowry size as the medieval period progressed, sometimes leading to dowries so large that they placed significant financial strain on families with several unmarried daughters. In rural England, manorial records, the detailed administrative documents kept by local lords, occasionally recorded fines paid by tenants for marrying without their lord's permission, revealing that even the personal decision of who to marry could, in certain feudal arrangements, require the approval of a local authority figure, entirely unrelated to either family. These regional differences remind us that medieval dating customs were not a single fixed system, but a broad, shifting patchwork of practices shaped by local law, economic conditions, religious interpretation, and centuries of slowly evolving tradition. Not every medieval courtship proceeded smoothly. Church court records, which survive in fragments across various European archives, occasionally document disputes between couples, broken betrothal promises, and even the rare scandal of a secret marriage conducted without family approval. Because a public exchange of vows before witnesses was generally sufficient for the church to consider a marriage valid, some couples took advantage of this by marrying secretly, without their family's knowledge or consent, hoping the marriage would later be accepted as a fact families could not undo. Such secret marriages sometimes led to lengthy, complicated legal disputes, as families attempted to have the church annul a match they had never approved. There are also recorded cases, though relatively rare, of women appealing to church courts on the grounds that a man had promised marriage in order to gain intimacy, and had then abandoned that promise. Church courts sometimes ruled in favor of the woman in these cases, occasionally compelling reluctant men to follow through with the marriage they had originally promised, reflecting the seriousness with which spoken promises, even informal ones, were treated under medieval canon law.